Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 5th chapter in Paul's epistle to the Ephesians. We made it all the way up to the 14th verse, so we're going to be taking it from the 15th to the end. But before we do that and read it out loud and comment, we just want to briefly review what we discussed in greater detail in the lesson before this. So the opening verse is, he identifies us as our children, and we are to imitate and emulate Elohim as our father. Because we are called as his children, he is to kind of serve as our model. So do all things that he will do, go where he tells us to go, do what he wants us to do, say what he wants us to say, be who he wants us to be. And the responsibilities of being adopted and belonging to this community of believers are outlined as let no evil come from you, so that no evil can be spoken, not only against you, but kind of this community that you belong to, that you represent and witness to out there in the world. And then in the 8th verse, he identifies us as children of light. So we are children of our Heavenly Father and of light. They are, light isn't the wholeness of it, his attributes, but it is certainly a part of it. And this, having been liberated from darkness, means that we must keep the light always before us to guide our walk, to guide our talk, to guide our speech, and to guide what we do. And then and he tells them to don't even have fellowship with the fruitless work of darkness, but rather reprove or expose them in other verses. So there is no reason that we should be associating with sinners other than for drawing them and winning them to the faith. And now the 15th through the 20th verse really defines, or at least describes, what a spirit-saturated life means and what a difference that makes, because the Spirit is the source of our unity. So the same Spirit which gives us the unity that is outlined in the first 16 verses of the 4th chapter, we read, are essential to the family dynamic, which we're going to cover verses 21 through 33. So the first verse we're going to read is the 15th, which says, "See then that you walk exactly, not unwise, but as wise." So we have two options and two outcomes. We can walk and live and speak and act as fools or people who are wise. And the fool says that where ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. But we know that we have a work to do which doesn't allow us the luxury to be foolish in our interactions, in our decisions, and anything else. So we are called to walk as wise people are. And wisdom, he has chosen the foolish people of the world to bring the wisdom of the world to naught, we read in the tail end of Paul's first chapter to the first epistle to the Corinthians. "Redeeming the time, because the days are wicked." Now, time in itself is, strictly speaking, irredeemable. It moves in a linear progression which cannot pause or cease. But what we can do is, the times that we live in are wicked. They've been wicked in every age. The majority of humanity is wayward and fallen and estranged and alienated from their Creator. But we can make a difference, even though the entire world around us is succumbing to evil. We can show them the better and the true way and make the most of our time. Never let this also entails a resourcefulness and a prudent management of the time which comes our way. We are to make the most of every moment, seize every opportunity which comes our ways. And a lot of the obstacles that we encounter on our path can be converted into opportunities by the disciplined practitioner of spiritual warfare. "So then, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of Yahweh is." The will of the Father is critical and key to our survival and our calling. We are to, in every way, seek out his will in prayer. And when we're done praying, when we go to worship by working, we are to manifest and enact his will and be vessels of his will and speak what his will is to others. And we cannot do this if we are foolish, because the fool says in his heart that there is no Yahweh. We read in the opening verses of the 14th and 53rd Psalms. And do not be drunk with wine, in which is loose behavior, but be filled with the Spirit. Now, when the Spirit first struck the original apostles, when Paul wasn't among them in their ranks at the day of Pentecost, the audience, the naysayers who had just witnessed these Galileans speaking in tongues, which to them sounded like psychobabble, it made no sense to them, but it made sense to the believers who were connected over the language barriers that the Spirit provided through these tongues. And the critics and naysayers say that they're drunk, and Peter says it's the 9th hour, or the 3rd hour, which would have been 9 p.m. So we are intoxicated on the Spirit, and the Spirit is a qualitatively superior form of intoxication to wine. And alcohol was a big part of my life before I became a Christian, but I don't want to fill the void that I used to fill with drugs and alcohol, with destructive habits or anything else. I want to be filled with the Spirit. In the Greek tension of the word translated as filled entails or perpetuity, an element of endurance. So it's not a one-time filling, just like you don't get drunk off one shot of alcohol. You have to keep filling. It's much the same principle for a different form of intoxication, an altogether better one. The intoxicating effects of alcohols and drugs make one stupid, foolish, immoral, paranoid, and but the only positive, there's no side effects, there's nothing to worry about when you are filled or intoxicated with the Spirit. Speaking to each other in psalms and songs of praise and spiritual songs, singing and striking the strings in your heart to the addon. So one of the consequences or effects of living a Spirit-saturated life is we will always have a song on our tongue in praise of the Master, and these will spring from our hearts, and we will often say them out loud. I'm not as musical as the average Christian worshiper is, but I do. I don't really have much of a singing voice, in case you haven't been able to guess that by listening to my real voice. But I sing in the choir, and it's not as important to me, but it's important to them. So I'm a member of the community. I sing along, and it's beautiful music. I just don't like the sound of my own voice. I prefer, but I do, try and make my voice at least known. Giving thanks always for all to Yahweh the Father, in the name of our Master, Yahshua Messiah. So gratitude is one of the fruits or side effects of a Spirit-saturated life. When we are grateful, we will survive, and we must always remain grateful, having been liberated from darkness into the light, as we earlier discussed, that we read in the 8th verse of this same chapter. So there is literally everything to be thankful for. The air we breathe, the life we have, everything, our entire existence owes to the one who created us not out of necessity, but love. So there's no excuse not to be grateful towards him in all times and all ways. Now the 21st through the 33rd verse marks somewhat of a turning point in terms of the section, and I think this speaks powerfully and poignant to the days, the days in which we live, because Paul is outlining the family dynamics of a spiritually saturated husband and wife, a marriage, and the family is under attack in our present generation. It is obvious to all. We are redefining the concept of marriage to accommodate certain people who choose to live their lives outside of the Creator's parameters. but I'm not here to indict. I don't condone homosexuality, neither do I condemn it. It's not my job. I'm not here to bash or belittle anyone. I'm here to warn, and the fact is that we heterosexuals are in a lot of ways even worse statistically at managing our homes than these people who are getting married who really shouldn't. But the divorce is rampant, and let me tell you, if you enter into your divorce with a marriage with divorce, an insurance plan, or a prenuptial agreement, that is an act of faithlessness. That is saying you don't trust that this love between you is meant to last until and beyond death does us part. So divorce is rampant, and fatherless communities are the new norm, at least in the African American community. 78% of black children have the misfortune to grow up in the absence of a father, and that has devastating ripple effects, which really affect not only them but anyone who grows up in a home without a father. And one of the reasons that women are becoming more assertive in their parentalism is not only the equality and ethos of modern feminism, but it's also a neglect from the male's part. So we do have to answer. And let's see. So 21st verse: subjecting yourselves to each other in the fear of Elohim. So this would have been not the to each other. He's not specific or explicitly speaking of husband and wife at this time, but merely the spiritual saturated community. But the subjection and submission is going to bleed into the next verse, which reads, "Wives, subject yourself to your own husbands as to the master." Now this is a verse that I feel a lot of certain preachers would shy away from for fear, but both genders are equal in God's eyes, and we are all one in the church. But that does not change the fact that the woman is functionally subordinate to the man in a proper marriage, properly practiced and executed, and it's part of the natural order. But wives who are already submitted to the master, the Messiah, will have no problem with subjecting themselves to a husband. And Paul has much more to say about the husband responsibilities as we read coming up. The husband that is similarly submitted to the same source. Because the husband is the head of the wife, as also Messiah is head of the assembly, and he is the Savior of the body. So the Messiah is likened to the head of his assembly, which is likened to a body by Paul most extensively in 1 Corinthians, the 12th chapter. But as the Messiah's supremacy is in the church, so too is the man's in the home. But headship is not dictatorship, because as we read, a man is to love his wife. He is not to, and a loving husband would never abuse or exploit his superior station at her expense. But as the assembly is subject to Messiah, so also let the wives be to their own husbands in every respect. So as the model that we have in the wider community of the assembly, which we are all submitted and subjected to the Messiah, that is the model that wives are to be in their own husbands in every key word, respect. So that 5-letter word entails a totality of submission, but this will be no problem in between a Christian husband and a Christian wife. They will get along and not at each other's expense, but that does not reverse the natural order of the family, according to which the man is to be the head, because the man is able to protect and the family, and as the not smarter but stronger gender. That's just one of the things we have to do. And The reason that women are becoming more assertive is many men are failing to be men. It's that simple. Any teenager can produce a child, but it takes a man to raise that child, and many men are not mature enough these days. There's a laxity about us that are so we have our own part to play in the increasingly assertiveness of the the unnatural equality and even supremacy of the female to the male in the home. Husband, love your wives as Messiah also loved the assembly and gave himself for it. So the Messiah, crucifixion and passion were the supreme expressions of love, and that is the same model of and standard of love which we are to love our wives. So there's really no higher standard, and that was an act of love because he became the innocent became the victim, and so the guilty could be acquitted. That's us. He became sin so that sinners could have their sin permanently eradicated from their record and enter into heaven because of what he did on that cross. And we are to be like-minded in our loves for our wives, in order to sanctify it and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, in order to present it to himself a splendid assembly, not having spot or wrinkle or any of the sort, but if it might be sacred and blameless. This ties us in perhaps the third through fifth verse, which outlines the type of sins which we are to not indulge in, not associate with, and not have any spot, because it brings a blemish on the one whose very blemishlessness made us blameless and sanctifies us. So we do have to treat the assembly with all the honor and respect, and we must not do anything that would hurt, harm, or injure anyone inside it or even outside of it that diminishes the reputation of us all in our communities. In this way, husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. So self-love is commonly interpreted as a perversion of love. Real love is expressed and manifest in reaction and response to others, but it's not to be selfish is to be unloving, but none of us would ever starve ourselves, deprive us of shelter or clothing or anything, etc. And so we must be similarly minded. We don't want to do anything to our wives that we wouldn't do to ourselves, but we also have to be willing to do things for our wife that we have that they cannot do for us. And women have the same complementary gifts, and they are to be nurtured in development. And my whole critique of, or a part of my critique of postmodern feminism is that it I try to avoid politics in general in these things. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but feeds and cherishes it, as also the master does the assembly. So that brings us back to what I said earlier. No one would starve themselves. We all are fed and nourished, and the Messiah, who is the bread of life and the water of life and our very life source, through whom we consume in communion to nourish ourselves spiritually through the digestion of physical food with added symbolic significance. But we are to, just as we would never deprive ourselves of spiritual nourishment, so too would we never deny ourselves of physical or carnal nourishment. So that we have to do the same thing to our wives and our wives. This is speaking of husbands, that the Messiah did for the assembly, and there are certain things that he did for us that we cannot do ourselves, so too must we do the same to our wives. Because we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones, so because we belong to him, that entails certain commitments and responsibilities, of which we'll soon read. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This brings us back to the origin, the primordial origin of family, as declared in Genesis 2:4. Adam and Eve were not the father and mother they weren't the sons or daughters of anyone, but they were the father and mothers, and their descendants and their progeny should eventually depart from the family which nourished them to form their own family when they are of a mature enough age to do their part in perpetuating the survival of our species. This mystery is great, but I shall speak concerning Messiah and the assembly. So a mystery is a theological term for a hitherto unveiled revelation, and Paul was privy to many mysteries, and this one he makes clear is great. However, you too, everyone, let each one love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she fears her husband. So the mystery is the interconnectedness of the love of the Messiah for his assemblies, which we are to mimic and imitate and emulate, bringing us back to the first verse of the chapter, in our homes and in our families and in our marriages. And the final verse, he just says everyone. That means everyone in the assembly, any and all of them must love their own wives as they do themselves. That means they must not do anything to their wives that they would not want to do for themselves, and they must also do things for their wives that they are unable to do for themselves. And the wife's responsibility is to revere. It's translated as fear, but that word doesn't mean quite the same thing in the Greek original as we read it. But in all honesty, I haven't consulted a concordance. That's not my normal preparation process for doing these things. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.